Hey everybody, don't be scared, but our first test in Masechet Bava is coming up soon. This video will review the material, or most of the material that we need to know for the test. Some of it will come from our introduction to Torah Shebaal Peh, some will come from our introduction to Masechet Bava, and a little bit will come from the beginning of our first unit of actual Gemara that we are doing. Here we go. As I mentioned before, our first unit comes from our introduction to Torah Shebaal Peh unit, where I'm going to ask you to demonstrate your knowledge of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the basics of what it does, and how it works. We started off by differentiating between the written Torah and the oral Torah. The Torah Shebaal Peh, which is what we're studying, is the oral Torah. But before that comes something called the Torah Shebechtav. Okay, as you're looking at it right here, the actual Torah scroll, the Torah Shebechtav, and that is what we call the written, sorry for the handwriting there, as usual, the written Torah. So what is included in the Torah Shebechtav? So besides the stories and besides the history, which is not what we're going to be dealing with, in terms of the mitzvot themselves, what's included in the Torah Shebaal Peh is what we called klalim. Okay, singular would be klal, and the translation that we used for klal was principle or general rule. We will use the word principle, which means the general basic rules of how Judaism is meant to be practiced. Now, if the Torah Shebaal Peh includes mostly principles, mostly klalim, general rules, so what is missing? What's missing is what we'll call the details. Okay? The details about how to fulfill mitzvot. That is what's missing. And if you want to know how to fulfill all these rules in the Torah down to their details, that's what you need the Torah Shebaal Peh for. Another distinction we made in class between general rules and details, principles and specifics, is the difference between klal and psak. Again, klal meaning principle, which basically means the general rules. Psak we translate it as application. How do I apply these rules in real life? So the Torah tells me you are supposed to keep Shabbat. That's the klal, that's the general rule. The psak would be, well, how do I apply that? How do I actually go about keeping Shabbat? So again, what you have in the Torah Shebechtav, so we have in the, well, this would be in the oral Torah. The oral Torah, the Torah Shebaal Peh, will give us the actual specific details how to carry it out, as opposed to in the written Torah, okay, the Torah Shebechtav, only, for the most part, only gives us the principles, the general rules, which we then, if we want to know how to carry them out properly, have to consult the Torah Shebaal Peh. A perfect example of this, like we discussed in class, is the pasuk which tells us that we have to sit in a sukkah on the holiday of Sukkot. All it says in the pasuk is, Basukot teshu shivat yamim. You must live in covered booths for 7 days. You have to sit in a sukkah. So what's the general rule? The general rule, the principle here, the klal is sit in a sukkah. What's the psak? How do I carry that out exactly? The Torah doesn't tell me how, right? If I'm looking at this, well, I can ask myself, well, what is a sukkah? What does a covered booth mean exactly? Are there any details to it? Or could it be any covered booth that I want? Also, what does it mean to live? Does that mean I can't leave the sukkah? Does that mean there are only certain things, right? What does teshuvah mean? I have to dwell, I have to live. What does that mean? If I had looked at the general rule, I wouldn't understand exactly what to do. That's what you need the Torah Shebaal Peh for. The Torah Shebaal Peh tells us that live means to do things like eat, or perhaps sleep. Okay, that covered booths have specifics to them. They have to be covered by schach. They have to have at least 3 walls. The walls have to be at least 10 tefachim high. They have to be a certain height. These are all the details. All of these are the details that the Torah Shebaal Peh tells us that are not written in the Torah Shebechtav. So if I want to know how do I actually practically live out, how do I apply the rules in the Torah Shebaal Peh? In the Torah Shebechtav, I have to look in the Torah Shebaal Peh, which will tell me these things. This is what I would refer to as explanation. The Torah Shebaal Peh explains what the Torah Shebechtav means. Additionally, a second role of the Torah Shebechtav is to interpret. But it's not explanation. We'll call this interpretation. How do I understand some of these mitzvot, even if I don't know exactly what to do? A good example would be, we did not discuss this one in class, the pasuk Lo Yobash Gever Simlat Isha. A man is not allowed to wear women's clothing. One issue that's discussed by the commentators in terms of this mitzvah is what happens if a person wants to dress up as a woman, like as a costume, like on Purim or something like that. Then would it be permitted at a wedding to be misamech hatam nekala, to make the wedding, to make the chassan and kala happy? Is that permitted? So some people would say yes, some people would say no. This is an example not of explanation, but of interpretation. And this is where you end up with machloket, where you have debates. One person might say, oh, this means no matter what, in all situations, a man can never wear something that a woman wears. Or some might say, yeah, that's only if you're trying to really look like a woman, but if everyone knows that it's a costume, then it could be permitted. This is an example, again, of interpretation. And again, this is where you get situations where there are multiple opinions. So where do I look if I want to find these laws, these explanations? Where is it going to tell me that a sukkah has to have walls that are 10 tefachim high? There has to be 3 of them. So for that, I look in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is very simply a collection of laws from the Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's just a list, it's a collection of all the details that are not included in the actual Torah, as many as were known at the time when the Mishnah was written down. The rabbis, if you remember, we discussed it in class, the rabbis at the time of the Mishnah were known as Tanaim. Singular would be a Tana. And these rabbis basically just memorized and passed along these laws, how big a sukkah has to be, tefillin have to be black, what's not allowed on Shabbat, what is allowed on Shabbat, the 39 categories that are not allowed on Shabbat. Sometimes there would be debates, as we pointed out, there is interpretation. But at the end of the day, the Mishnah has a collection of laws from the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and this is the collection of laws that were most widely accepted by people. You won't find a lot of discussion in the Mishnah, very, very little. Where will you find some discussion? In the Gemara. Because even though you have in the Mishnah a lot of laws, the laws, don't have every single possible situation. Sometimes there might be a debate about it in terms of what the halacha is supposed to be. And that can be found in the Gemara. The Gemara is a discussion based on the Mishnah. If you look in the Talmud, you'll see a Mishnah, and then you'll see the Gemara has this long conversation based on the Mishnah where it discusses back and forth. What's the reason? Oh, but there's another statement which contradicts the Mishnah. What about in this situation? What about in that situation? That's how the Gemara works. It's a discussion based on the Mishnah, but the Mishnah is the avenue, is the place, the address, to go to if you want to know basic laws in the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Additionally, we did also mention in class what's called a Breita. A Breita, which actually one other component of the Torah Sheba'al Peh that we didn't mention, we did mention in class, we haven't mentioned yet, actually belongs right in between here, and that is what's known as a Breita. I'm not going to write the translation here, I'll just mention that a Breita also comes from the Tanaim, but a Breita is simply the laws that from the Torah Sheba'al Peh, from Tanaim, that just didn't make it into the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, when he finally edited the Mishnah, put all the most popularly kept laws, and the Breita were just statements that were floating around from Tanaim that people just that just didn't make it, weren't as popular, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did not include them in the Mishnah. But again, since they're from Tanaim, they are just as significant. Those are basically the things that we learned about the Torah Sheba'al Peh. When we review in class, we might go over a couple of additional things. Now let's move on to Masechet Bava Kama. The second unit that we did, which we called actually Unit 1, Yechida Aleph, if you look on Haiku, is our introduction to Masechet Bava Kama. Just to point out what is a Masechet. So we made this little chart in class, right, of the concentric circles, where we have Seder, Masechet, Perek, and in this case, sometimes you have Mishnah. So in this case, you start off with a Seder. And then in each Seder you have a Masechet, and in each Masechet you have a Perek, and in each Perek you have Mishnayot. So in our case, we are learning the Seder that Bava Kama is in is Seder Nezikin, and the Masechet, which is in each Seder, is Masechet Bava Kama. That's what we are learning, and each Masechet has a bunch of prakim, bunch of chapters, and each chapter contains Mishnayot, which have the laws. And again, the Gemara is just a commentary on those Mishnayot. Sorry for the sloppiness of the diagram. Masechet Bava Kama is in Seder Nezikin, and Seder Nezikin deals mostly with damages. So we did first is we looked at these psukim that relate to damages, and what we noticed is that the psukim that talk about it, what happens if you damage someone else's property. In these psukim, you'll see about 4 different ways in which somebody can damage somebody else, We call these 4 avot, which we'll see when we review the Mishnah. So let's look through these psukim quickly and find these 4 things. So the first mentioned is in Perek Lamed Gimel, Ki yiftach ish bor. If a person will open up a pit, and that is one way you can damage somebody, right? You dig a hole and somebody falls in, or it says also if you dig a pit and don't cover it, O ki yachra ish bor v'lo yichasenu, and then something falls in and then it breaks. That's one way to do it. The next one we have was, and if the ox of one person gores the ox of another and it dies, the chi yigov shor ish et shor re'ehu v'met. So that's a situation where my property went out, something that I'm responsible for. My animal went and destroyed your property. The third one was if somebody causes a vineyard or field to be eaten by sending the eater. Now, this is a rough translation. The key there is v'shilachet be'ero. You literally purposely take the animal, which is going to eat up someone's field, and you send that animal into the field. So we call that directly damaging someone. And the last one was, and if a fire spreads, ki teitzei eish umatzakotzim, right? It grabs onto thorns or whatever it is, and it spreads. So you light a fire, you don't watch it properly, it spreads and it damages someone else's property. So that was another example. So that was our 4th category, 4th way in which damage can be done that is found in the psukim. So again, let's look at that one more time. So we have 1 here, 2 here, 3 here, and 4 here. These are 4 categories, or what we're going to refer to as 4 avot, okay, which we're going to translate as paradigms, actually. And this is what the first Mishnah, Masechet Bava Kama, tells us. Again, if you notice at the top of the page, you need to know this too. Here's the name of the Masechet Bava Kama. Perek Rishon means it's the first parak. Arba Avot is the name of the parak, and you'll see very, very straightforward that it comes from the name Arba Avot, the first 2 words of the first Mishnah, and that the daf here is Bet Amud Aleph. You have to know that that's where you find the daf and the amud of a Gemara page. And let's look at this. Let's look at this first line of this Mishnah. Arba Avot Nizikin. There are 4 categories, 4 paradigms of damaging somebody. Shor, an ox, which is if my property damages someone else's property. A bor, a pit, right? If I open up a pit, I dig a pit, and someone falls in. So it's me putting something dangerous in public. Mav'eh is if I directly send something to damage. The hever and a fire. If I light something, I light a fire, I do something, and I don't watch it properly, and then something in nature comes along. In this case, it was the grass or it was the wind, and kind of blows that over into someone else's property and damages. That's a 4th way you can damage somebody. And we didn't go through this, but if you look, it says below hare shor kahare ma'avet. It starts off, and damages like an ox is not the same as direct damage. Because the idea is these 4 categories, these are avot, they each have different laws, and that's why it's important to know when damage was done, which of these 4 categories was the damage fall into. That way you know what the laws are in terms of deciding who has to pay and how much they have to pay. So quickly to review, to number them now, each one. So we have a shor is, sorry about that. We have a shor is my first one, a bor is my second one, a ma'aved, direct damage, is my third, and hever, lighting a fire, which then spreads, is my 4th category of damage. As we pointed out in class, these are all paradigms. Doesn't mean it only has to be an ox, only if it's a pit. These are all examples, right? These are perfect examples of their category. Then you could give other examples on your own once you figure out where each one belongs. Then within the av, within the paradigm, within the category of shor, which was what happens about if my animal, my possession goes out and damages, we pointed out in the psukim that there are 2 different categories here as well. Those 2 categories were known as tam and mu'ad. Tam is the one where damage is not expected, where I own this animal, but how was I supposed to know it was going to do it? It's not my fault. And mu'ad is a situation where damage was expected, and because I knew the damage was going to happen, I have to pay in full. If you look at the psukim, we'll look at the English quickly, when an ox will gore a man or a woman and kill them, the ox should be stoned, and the owner of the ox is innocent. But if the ox had gored 3 times before, right, that's a mu'ad situation. Now the owner knew and didn't watch it, right? So now the owner knows that this is a dangerous ox. The owner knows this is a mu'ad situation, that this ox can easily do damage in the future. We know that it's dangerous. Then it says the owner shall die as well. Now, the owner doesn't actually have to die if this ox then goes and kills somebody, but the psukim are pointing out that once you know that there's a situation where you know that damage should be expected, this is a dangerous ox, you are then held fully responsible. And when it comes to damages, we pointed out, you have to pay nezek shalem, full damages. I guess just to chart it out. So again, mu'ad, you pay nezek. Oops, sorry about that. I spelled that wrong. Let's fix that. Mu'ad pays. Oops, one more time. Sorry. Nezek shalem, which means full damages, because you knew that your animal, you knew that it was a situation where damage was probably going to happen. As he points out, it's not only an animal. The example we gave in class was a child who spits up a lot. You know that your child is mu'ad. It's very common that your child spits up. And then your child spits up on someone's carpet and ruins it. You have to pay full because you knew that could have happened. As opposed to a tom situation where you didn't know damage could have happened, right? You have a cat, and cats never try to kill people. And all of a sudden this cat jumps on someone and injures them very badly, which wasn't expected. So then you only pay chatzi nezek. You only pay chatzi, the word is half damages, because since it's not, you couldn't have expected it to happen, even though it was your possession that did it, how was I supposed to know? There's nothing I could have done, and therefore I only have to pay half of the damages. In class we discuss other examples, and that's for you to study and to think about. You're going to have to recognize those examples on the test. Then, if you look in the Mishnah on Daf Tet Vav Amud Bet, the Mishnah lists, to help us understand these laws better, examples of situations where you would be paying in full because you should have expected damage, and examples where you couldn't have expected it. Chamisha tamim chamisha muadin. There are 5 tam situations and 5 muad situations. Let's list them. Behema eina muedet. So an animal, a domesticated animal, is not expected to damage. Lo ligach, to bite. Velo ligof, to push with its body. Velo lishoch. I'm sorry, that means to bite. Ligof is to gore. Ligach is to push with the body. Velo lerbos, not to trample. Velo levo, not to kick. None of those things are expected. And if your animal does that, it's a cow, does one of those things, you only pay half. Hashem, when it comes to eating, mu'edet lechol rayula, it's expected to eat all that it normally eats. So if you have a cow, it's going to eat grass, and you're going to be held accountable to pay full. Haregel, when it comes to its feet, mu'edet lishbor b'derech elucha. It's mu'ad, you expect that it's going to step on things that are in its way. So if you have a cow and you're walking it down the street, and it steps on something in its path, you can't say, oh, I didn't know it was going to do that. No, it's a mu'ad. We expect it. An animal doesn't watch where it's going. Vishor hamuad, which is what we mentioned, a shore that is dangerous. The example of psukim is an animal like a shore that gored 3 times, but again, you can have other ways of knowing something is dangerous. And then shor mazik b'shur nizak v'ha'adam, and man, which is important also for later on. That man is also considered muad, that you have to pay full damage if you yourself damage. Hazeh v'ha'ari v'ha'dov v'ha'namer v'ha'bardalas v'ha'nachash, wild animals like a wolf, like a lion, like a bear, a panther, a leopard, or a snake. Harei l'muadin, these are also muad, whether or not they gored 3 times, as he pointed out, or attacked 3 times. Shor muad is just an example, a paradigm for the type of animal that is expected to damage. Here are animals that are also all expected to damage. Rabbi Eliezer adds something that we discussed, bisman shehein b'nei tarbut, but if they are domesticated, they're trained, eina muadot, you can't be held responsible. If you train your lion, if you train a bear, and then it attacks and kills somebody, I was trying to say kill somebody, then it attacks and breaks something, or, destroys something that belongs to somebody else, it's not your fault, said Rabbi Eliezer. You weren't expecting because you trained your animal. We don't necessarily paskin that way. We don't necessarily follow that as a halacha, but that's Rabbi Eliezer opinion. However, Nachash muad lam. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that a snake cannot be trained, and a snake is always muad, and if your snake does damage, you always have to pay in full. Again, the point here is not to memorize each of these things. The point is to note the Mishnah is giving examples of tam and muad situations, because it's not just about the ox. It's about are you expecting damage to happen, or are you not expecting damage to happen? These are the basics of what we had to know in terms of the halachot related to Bava Kama, in terms of damage, in terms of the 4 categories, in terms of tam and muad. And now we're going to move on to review the beginning, at least, of the first Gemara that we did. So let's just do a quick review of at least the first lines of Gemara in Unit 2, the lines that will be on this test. Yechida Bet can be found again on our Haiku page if you want to look for the material from that unit. So let's quickly read through this Gemara. Again, our Gemara here, this was on Daf Chavav Amud Bet. Again, sorry, I don't have it zoomed out so you can see the daf. Let's read the Gemara quickly. It was a statement from Rabbah and the halacha and the reason quickly. Va'amar Rabbah said, Zarak klimi rosh agag. If someone threw an object off a roof, uba acheret, someone else comes along with shiv roba makel and breaks it with a stick before it hits the ground. Patur, the person who broke it with a stick is patur, is exempt. Now, why would the person be exempt from having to pay if they were the one who actually broke this object? My tama, what's the reason? Mana tavira tavar. He broke a broken object, meaning since this object that when it was thrown off the roof was on its way to smashing on the ground, and it had the force in it that was going to break it, therefore when the person smashed it before it hit the ground, he does not have to pay because it was going to break anyway. Now, who exactly is patur in this case? Is it just the person who smashed it before it hit the ground? What about the person who threw it off the roof? Is the person who threw it off the roof patur as well? So it's hard to tell. All the Gemara says is patur. So if we looked at Rashi, and Rashi says the following. Sorry for sliding it over here. So Rashi says the following. Who is patur? So Rashi says, well, look at Rashi Zarak. Who threw this object off the roof? So Rashi says, Zarak bal hakli kli mirosh agag. We must be talking about a case where the owner of the object threw the object off the roof. Why would Rashi say that? Why can't it be somebody else? Because the Gemara says very straightforward, patur, that the person that everyone here is exempt. It doesn't say that anyone's chayav. So the person who smashes it before it hit the ground is patur. We understand why. Why? My time. But what's the reason? Mana tavir tavar. They broke a broken object. It was going to break anyway. It was on its way to breaking. So what if I broke it? But what about the person who threw it? Why do we say patur here? So Rashi says it must be talking about a case where the object was thrown off the roof by the owner. As he points out, you don't have to read it that way. It's possible when it says patur, it only means the person who broke it before it hit the ground. Maybe the person who threw it is chayav. But that's how Rashi reads this Gemara. Okay, you're going to have to know this Rashi and explain on the test why is it that Rashi thinks that the owner. Why does Rashi explain the case that the owner was the one who threw the object off the roof? Again, straightforward case. That's all we did in class so far in terms of what you're responsible for on the test. Good luck studying. We'll discuss in class tomorrow.